Hi, welcome back to Invisible Innocence, and I am your host, Meghan Moret. Today, we are going to be talking to Dan Nash, the founder of the Human Trafficking Training Center. And today, we are going to get a completely different look and perspective into human trafficking. But first, as always, I would like to remind viewers and listeners that we will be discussing sensitive content, so listening and viewer discretion is advised. So, Dan, hi.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm well. Thank you very much.
Good. Hey, thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know you have a lot going on right now, so I really appreciate you taking some time to chat with us and help us out with this awesome two-part episode that we are going to be doing today. So you were just saying that I made Dan put some shade up on his window so that we could see him a little bit better. And he was like, oh, I mean, that's the bad part of living in the mountains. It's so rough. You just don't have to have curtains on your windows. So where exactly are you from again, Dan?
I live down in the Ozarks. I live about 30 minutes outside of Branson, out in the Mark Twain National Forest. And I'm fortunate enough to live on some land out here in the mountains. And yeah, I don't really have curtains on my house because I don't have any neighbors. And I like to have the view of the mountains all the time and watch the leaves fall and the snow fall and the storms blow across in the summer. And that's so, yeah, I kind of like
God,
not having
I
curtains.
can't imagine ever being able to live in a home where I didn't need to have curtains or shades or something. So that's just got to be awesome. And you're from that area, right? I know you weren't born there, but you were raised there, right?
Yeah, I've lived in the Ozarks since I was 6 years old, so I'm pretty much, here. I was born
Yeah.
out of state, but yeah, I grew up here and went to high school here, went to college here and in Arkansas, and then I've lived in Missouri ever since.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so I want to talk first about your history and your career in law enforcement. So, what did you do and how long were you doing it for?
So I was in law enforcement for a really long time, really, when I think back about it. I was a Missouri State Trooper for 27 years and did a variety of things. I was in patrol, like, everybody starts off in patrol. And then I eventually went into the investigative side and I did narcotics and vice crimes for 6 years. That was really my introduction to quote unquote the prostitution world. And really had no idea what I was doing and had no training. And we'll talk about that later, I'm sure. And then I eventually went into major crimes like homicides and things like that. And then eventually ended my career helping to build and run the human trafficking unit across the state of Missouri.
Wow. And so tell us a little bit about your first introduction to human trafficking. Was it stuff that you had learned about? Did you have training prior to actually coming, face to face with these situations? Or tell me like about how it was for you when you first were introduced to the harsh reality of trafficking.
Well, my first introduction was really back in the late 1990s, but I didn't know what human trafficking was because I was not trained in it. Really, law enforcement back in those days wasn't trained at all. Law enforcement's really not trained either today, but at that point we had no training, no mentors, no anything. And really, my introduction was prostitution. And we literally arrested people for prostitution and took them to jail. And we patted ourselves on the back and we thought we were doing our part for God and country. It was only later in life that I realized that I think I'm arresting trafficking victims here. And
Mhm.
I don't think we're doing this correctly. So it was really only later that I was able to look back and realize how wrong we had been and what we were doing was not right. So that was my first introduction to what trafficking was, but I really didn't even know that I was actually seeing it.
Gosh, so would you say that that's still right now, is that a particularly big problem that people are having, is identifying the difference between prostitution and trafficking, like within law enforcement and really outside of law enforcement as well?
Yeah, it's pretty standard across the board, whether you're in or out of law enforcement. But most law enforcement officers, even to this day, have a really hard time differentiating between prostitution and trafficking. We know what the academic research says. It's all really consistent, whether it's research from here in the United States and in Canada, or it's research in Europe. And that research basically is somewhere between 90 and 93% of people involved in commercial sex, in other words, prostitution, are actually under some kind of third-party control. And I think for whatever reason, and I'm not really sure how or why, but we think of these people that are involved in prostitution as, just some hooker, just some drug addict, just some whatever, some person that has made really bad choices in life, and this is where they ended up, or this is what they choose to do. But in reality, if you really think about it common sense wise, who chooses prostitution? And if people actually did choose prostitution, then we wouldn't need traffickers, would we? But yet, when you really look into what's going on with most of these people involved in commercial sex, they almost always have a trafficker.
Yeah.
So it's pretty clear that the academic research is consistent. And what I've seen in just my experience of law enforcement for 27 years is that most of these people are under third-party control.
Mm. Okay, so then with that being said, can you give a clear-cut definition in the difference between prostitution, sex work, and sex trafficking? I mean, are there clear-cut lines? Do they kind of intermix? Or, because again, prostitution, we're taught and everybody's taught that, prostitution is something that you generally you're down for. Like you want to do, you signed up for it, you're doing it for whatever reason, whether it's, for money to feed yourself, feed your kids, go to college, whatever it may be. And then the difference between that of someone that is being trafficked, that is being forced into the situation.
So in my experience, and again, the academic research all 100% supports this, no matter what side of the ocean you're on, whether you're in Europe or you're in the United States, and that is that most people do not want to do this, and that 90 to 93% of the people are doing it because someone else is, forcing them or has some kind of third-party control over them. So the idea that this is just something that people want to do is really more of a political narrative than it is anything. The whole idea of the term sex worker, most people don't even understand where the term sex worker came from, but it really came from traffickers. So when you hear people using the term, sex work, that what you're doing is you're giving the traffickers credit. I mean, that term has been around for a long, long time. It was, in the last 10 years or so, or even a little bit longer, has been, become part of more of a political narrative type situation. But, the traffickers coined that term, sex worker, as in there's nothing to see over here, just a girl over here working. That was just a way for them to cover what they were actually doing. I mean, you can go back to the 1970s Clint Eastwood movies and the old Dirty Harry movies, where there's a quote unquote pimp, the trafficker, with these girls, and they were calling them, just a working girl. They were calling them working girls. They were calling them sex workers back then.
Yeah.
So this is really more of a political narrative than it is truth about what is actually going on. And
so basically, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, when you really start breaking it down and you really spend some time trying to figure out what is actually going on in these situations, most of the time it is someone that is being forced to do this. Now, is there a very small percentage of people that choose this? Yes, but they're very, very small.
Yeah. So these are terms that are used to disguise what's truly going on, to try and make it look like they are being less victimized, and that, that there is not a third party that is responsible for these
and
acts.
even if you wanted to do this on your own, they refer to that as on the street as someone called a renegade. When they're called a renegade on the street, that means that they're actually out there doing it without a trafficker, right?
Yeah.
Even if you are a renegade on the street, so if Meghan is a renegade on the street, right, and I'm a trafficker, I'm gonna not know who you are, and I'm gonna see your ads, whether you're on escort sites or you're working a blade or a street or whatever, and I'm going to force you or not allow you to be a renegade, because in America, you're worth about $200,000 a year to me. So why am I going to let you renegade versus bring you into my stable? And the answer is that's very difficult to do. The traffickers beat these girls up, they assault them, they do horrible things to them until they become part of their stables.
Wow. Okay, so you have observed, you've witnessed several different types of crime, so several different types of abuse, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, mental abuse, verbal abuse. You've seen it all. So, can you, in words, is there any way to describe the difference between the type of abuse that is involved with trafficking and these other forms of abuse that you have seen time and time again? You know, do you
Well, domestic violence or sexual assault, I mean, those are horrible things. They're horrible, hideous things. But trafficking, I think, is really almost like a combination of all these things. So the trafficker might actually sexually assault you as a way to control you. They're not interested in sexual gratification; they're interested in money. Whereas a predator is more interested in sexual gratification. But as a trafficker, am I going to maybe sexually assault you to control you, to trauma bond? Of course. Am I going to commit domestic violence against you to control you? Of course. Am I going to use all of your vulnerabilities and exploit those vulnerabilities, whatever they are? Maybe you grew up poor, maybe you grew up rich, maybe you grew up from a broken home, maybe you had a trauma as a child. I'm going to do everything that I can to control you. So to me, the traffickers are the worst of all because they're incorporating all these different aspects onto one person.
Yeah. And Dan, I think the biggest thing for me is that I want to, for people to understand, and I want to relay to them that trafficking does not discriminate. It's in every socioeconomic background, every race, every gender. And so, what is there anything that you want people to know as far as that is concerned too? I think that what we try to do when we think of trafficking is we take our mind off the true reality of it and off the fact that it is truly happening right here, right in our own neighborhoods, our own communities, our own very own backyard. And it's important for people to realize that it's not like the movies. I mean, can it happen like you see in the movies? Most definitely. But I think the important thing is to really have people understand that it's closer to home than they realize. And what do
Yeah,
you
so in America, some 65 to 70% of all trafficking victims are just Americans. We think it's they're just bringing people from overseas or whatever, and that's really not what we see. 2/3 to three-quarters are just American citizens, and a third or whatever is international. And then I think the other thing that people really get confused about is they think that, as a trafficking victim, you're kidnapped off of the Target parking lot or off of the street because
yeah.
we saw the movie Taken or Sound of Freedom or something like that. But that's not what trafficking is. In America, if your child is trafficked, it's going to be, or I mean, if your child is kidnapped in America, most of the time it's going to be the non-custodial parent. I mean,
Yeah.
that's like almost 70% of the time. Now,
Mhm.
do predators sometimes kidnap kids off the street? Yes, but traffickers seldom do that. That's just not how they operate. They are going to find those vulnerabilities that you have and exploit those and use those against you.
Right. So it's a lot easier for a trafficking situation to occur because it can be familial. It can be someone that the victim knows versus, having somebody come in, I always say like a ninja in the middle of the night with an AK-47, and a, bandana on, and whisking someone off in the middle of the night. It actually happens a lot easier, which is sad and scary at the same time.
Yeah, a third of all trafficking in America is friends and family. So a
Right.
third of trafficking in the United States is your husband, your fiance, your boyfriend, your mother, your father. It's someone that you know close and intimately.
And that is such a harsh reality too, and I think that is so hard for people to comprehend and understand that someone that is that close to someone has the capability of, you know, subjecting them to such a horrendous crime. It's really, for people like us, it's just unfathomable because you can't imagine ever doing that, but it's happening, and that's why I think education and awareness is huge. Just letting people know what to look for and signs so that they can prevent it from happening to someone, or prevent it from further continuing. So that's what I think is really important about it. But I want to know, so in your own personal experience, what were the ages and the sexes of most of the trafficking victims that you worked with?
Most of them were adults, late teens, early 20s, mid 20s,
Mhm.
probably, or most of them. But does that mean that that's when they started? And there's research on this, and I think the research is somewhere around, 15, 16, 17 is a super common age
Mhm.
to become trafficked, at the first. There is some research out there that said that, 14, but then they kind of went back on that, kind of contradicted that. But late teens, early 20s is really consistent.
Yeah, and were they mostly female, males? Were they one over the other? I'm
It's a
assuming
majority of
female,
females. I would
but
say 85 to 90% of my experience is females.
yeah. Okay, and what type of socioeconomic background would you say your victims came from? Did it vary, or was it
I've seen all of it. I've
yeah,
seen from super poor to middle class to very wealthy. I had a trafficking victim one time whose parents were super wealthy, and she was in like a boarding school and had a nanny and a butler.
yeah,
And when you start looking at what her vulnerability was, her parents were never around. They had both had really high end jobs. They were traveling to Europe all the time. They were doing all these, stuff. And she was the only child. And she was, like I said, she was in boarding school. And you look at her and you're like, how did you end up out here? And you realize, what was her vulnerability? Her vulnerability was just love. She was just
right,
looking for love, and she wasn't getting that. And if the trafficker sees that your vulnerability is love, then they provide love. The trafficker sees that you're poor, then they provide money. The trafficker sees, whatever it is, you didn't have a father figure in their life, they become that father figure.
right. And that's really important too, to constantly reiterate to people that victims fall prey because of their vulnerabilities. And like Dan's saying, it can be simply because they don't have a relationship with their family, with their parents. It could be that they're struggling in their peer group or at school. And so whatever they're lacking, someone is preying upon them to give them whatever it is that they're missing. It could be substance abuse. It could be that they were a runaway. There's so many different things that make them more vulnerable when someone is looking to snatch them up and make them a victim of their sick crimes, to say the least. But so let's then talk about, what type of traffickers have you come into? Like, what do they look like? What do they act like? Do they look like they're a criminal? Do they look clean cut? Like, tell me everything you can about the traffickers that you've come in contact with.
So most of the traffickers that I've come into contact with, I mean, there are some that you would not know. Like, for example, if it was a fiance or a husband or something like that, or even a parent that you would be surprised about. But a lot of the traffickers, honestly, you're not surprised when you find out that they're the trafficker, because a lot of traffickers are also committing other crimes. They're selling drugs. They're involved in assaults. They're involved in, a host of other criminal activity. So typically, I would say 75% of the time, law enforcement knows who the traffickers are. They just may not know that they're a trafficker. They may know them as a drug dealer or a
Mhm.
gang member or something else, but they know who the traffickers are. Typically, like I said, they just may not know that they are actually engaging in trafficking. They may know them for other crimes.
Yeah, so like a side hustle, which is really gross to think about, that these guys, they've got a little bit of this going on, a little bit of that going on, little drugs, little trafficking, and boy, the sooner we can find those guys, let's get them and lock them up and put them where they need to be. Would you say that any of the traffickers that you've met in your life, were they also at a younger age? Do you think that they were victims of trafficking?
I have not found that to be true, but honestly, I've not had a lot of conversations with traffickers about their childhood or things like that. But in my experience, traffickers are just criminals. And like I said, it's not just that they were trafficked or that they're just simply doing this because it's a moneymaker.
Yeah.
That's simply it. I mean,
Yeah.
I know lots of traffickers that were drug dealers previous, but then they realized, wow, I have a lot more of a risk to be arrested if I'm a drug dealer. Plus, I got to have, a contact on the border, and I got to get drugs brought up from the border to St. Louis, let's say, or whatever. And then I got to get my drugs out there, and I got to sell the drugs, and I got to bring the money back, and I got to do all the stuff. And there's a lot of people involved. Traffickers, I just get some girls out of St. Louis and traffic them, and I don't have to worry about all this other stuff. And because law enforcement is not trained very well in trafficking, my chances of being arrested are pretty slim, whereas my chances are much greater. And if I was a drug trafficker, so if I'm going to be a criminal, why not be a trafficker versus a drug dealer?
Right. Would you say that this type of commercial sex is just as I guess profitable as the drug industry, the illegal drug industry, or is it more profitable?
Well, it's the second largest criminal enterprise in the world. It's about $236 billion a year internationally. So it's right behind the drug trafficking trade. They're the two most profitable criminal enterprises in the world, drug trafficking and human trafficking. But again, the chances of you being arrested typically are higher in drug trafficking because law enforcement's really, really highly trained in the war on drugs. Plus, the budgets to fight drugs are immense. So I think the federal budget on the war on drugs is something like $3 or $4 billion a year. And the war on human trafficking is like 132 million.
Yeah.
Think about that. 132 million versus 3 or 4 billion. If I was a criminal, I'd be taking my chances to traffic people.
Yeah. And like you said, law enforcement in many places is not trained in how to react and quite frankly, just how to even identify trafficking. And so with trafficking, there's a whole nother element to it. And I think that the biggest part is that you're not just going in and finding drugs, finding a dealer, finding a buyer, and going in and being like, okay, everybody, hands up, take the drugs, take the bad guy, the buyer. But the element to trafficking is that you've got someone there that is a victim, and it could be as far as torture. We know that there's force, fraud, and coercion going on, but you have to tread lightly with these victims because who knows how long they've been victimized like this? Who knows if they're willing to talk? Who knows if they even know that they're being trafficked? So there's so many different elements to this, which I think, and that's where you come in and with what you specialize in and making sure that people know how to identify a specific trafficking situation and how to process moving forward. Unfortunately, people just are not ready for it. And that's why we need people like you to bring education to people. And not everybody is equipped. Not everybody, I would even say that there's law enforcement officers as well that are not equipped to do something like this or to be involved in something like this. Whether it's because it's too hard to see or whether they have this preconceived notion of what's going on, like we talked about, whether it's prostitution, sex work, or whatever. But you really have to be willing to take the time to analyze what's happening. Would you agree with that?
For sure. And if you look at the research again on what law enforcement gets when it comes to human trafficking, it's somewhere around 17% of law enforcement in America gets any kind of human trafficking training whatsoever. And I don't think the general public realizes that.
17%?
Well, and that is only any trafficking training. So if you actually break that down between skills training and awareness training, and awareness is basically something that we would give the general public, where you notice something is not right, and you say something, kind of like what we learned after 9/11. If you see something, say something, right?
Yeah.
But what law enforcement needs is skills. They need to know what a trafficker looks like and how to investigate it, how to gather evidence, and how to do this investigation. And if you look at that, we're talking less than 10% of law enforcement in America has that type of training. So how do we expect law enforcement to be successful if we send them out there and they're not trained properly? I mean, I was never trained properly in the academy. I mean, most of what I learned was through trial and error. And because of that, I look back and go, man, there's a whole host of victims that I let fall by the wayside, that I was not there to help, that I was not there to serve and protect.
Gosh, yeah. We're gonna cut here and we're gonna go on to the next episode. But like I always like to tell our listeners, if you or someone you know is being exploited in this way or in any way, please call 911 as soon as you are in a safe place, or you can call the human trafficking hotline as a resource at 1-888-374-7888. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.